my pleasure to introduce Dr. Benjamin Pickus, who will be giving us the grand rounds this morning. Dr. Pickus was born in Northern Virginia and raised in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax specifically. He then attended the University of Virginia for undergrad, where he majored in environmental and urban planning. Is it urban and environmental planning? Those things. All right. He then attended medical school at the University of Pittsburgh and is now completing his residency here at the University of Wisconsin. He is slated to finish his residency this year and then will be joining UW as faculty member. So please join me in welcoming him as he talks about climate change, how to think global and act local as an OBGYN.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this is my talk, Climate Change, How to Think Global and Act Local as an OBGYN. I wanted to focus on this topic because I've always been interested in climate change. It was the world I thought I was going to work in before I found medicine. And I hope today I can convince everyone that the problems associated with healthcare are not so dissimilar from the problems we face from global climate change. I have no financial disclosures, unfortunately. Our learning objectives for today, we're going to examine the current state of climate change. We're going to summarize the effects of climate change on our patient population. We're going to explain current mitigation plans, and then we're going to discuss current actions and next steps to take. All right, so let's get started by defining and understanding climate change. So what is climate change? Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions, but most scientists who study climate change agree that since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas, and the subsequent generation and release of greenhouse gases. In order to discuss climate change, it's important to discuss the difference between weather and climate. Weather refers to the short-term state of the atmosphere. It can change within minutes or hours, while climate refers to the long-term pattern of weather in a specific place and is the average of weather over decades. Climate does affect weather, so changing climate will change weather patterns, but the large variation in day-to-day weather makes it sometimes difficult to feel the subtle changes in climate over time. Looking deeper at climate change, we need to understand how energy cycles work on the Earth. Nearly all the energy that is available on Earth's surface comes from the sun. The sun's energy drives the hydraulic cycle, ocean waves and currents, and global atmospheric circulation. This graphic shows the sun's energy cycling through our Earth in different ways. The big takeaway from this picture is the greenhouse gases up here. They accumulate in the atmosphere and retain the heat generated by the sun and released from the planet, which then becomes trapped on Earth in various different reservoirs. This concept is called the greenhouse effect. When we talk about climate change, we're really talking about changes in the Earth's energy level and average temperature that lead to downstream effects that end up impacting our climate. Simply, the surface temperature of Earth is determined by the amount of sunlight the Earth receives, the amount of sunlight reflected from the Earth's surface, and the degree to which the atmosphere retains heat radiated from the Earth. The Earth's energy budget compares the flows of incoming and outgoing energy that are relevant in the climate system. Since at least the 1970s, less energy is flowing out than is flowing in, which leads to excess energy being absorbed in the ocean, land, and atmosphere. You can see in this image that the ocean is actually the main reservoir of accumulated energy on our planet. One of the main drivers of the greenhouse effect of climate change is carbon dioxide. In this graph, we can see the rapid increase in carbon dioxide seen in recent geologic history in the last 800,000 years. You can see this is all average CO2 levels over 800,000 years, and then this is our current level, skyrocketing pretty quickly. Looking closer at recent changes in atmospheric CO2 levels, the image on the left represents atmospheric CO2 measured at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. You can see that the level has been continuously increasing for the past 70 years of observation. This is the longest running CO2 measurements that we have in this state. It started measuring atmospheric levels of CO2 in March of 1958. The observatory is an ideal location for studying CO2 levels as the air is relatively clean due to being over 11,000 feet above sea level and being a long distance away from significant pollution sources. These measurements are one of the best data points on how our atmosphere is changing with climate change. The gases that are being trapped in our atmosphere are mostly CO2, but also include methane and nitrous oxide. Not all greenhouse gases are equally created though. Compared to carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide causes 265 times as much warming per weight, and methane causes 28 times as much warming through their different ways of insulating the plant. Okay, because we're in Wisconsin, I wanted to briefly touch on the greenhouse gas distributions of the beef and dairy production. Cows are a large producer of methane through their own emissions, which then contribute to total global greenhouse gases and climate change. Globally, cows are responsible for over 75 million tons of methane released annually. In the United States, cows are responsible for around 4.5% of total emissions, but in Wisconsin, because of our strong dairy industry, cows are responsible for around 9% of our total state emissions. All right, so we've talked about what climate change is and how it's related to elevated carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas levels. Now we'll discuss why we think it's anthropogenic or human-caused in nature. So Earth's mean surface temperature has varied over Earth's history. This graph shows the variation in mean global temperature over the past 570 million years. This line in the middle is the current global temperature. You can see there has been much variation in global temperature dating back to long before humans were around. Some natural factors in Earth's climate history include the past distribution of the continents, distribution of mountains, activity of volcanoes, impacts of asteroids, and even the Earth's tilt, which can change the amount of solar radiation the Earth receives. All of this to say there are multiple causes of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions beyond just human causes. So if there are many natural drivers of climate change, how do we know humans are causing it? So this graph is from the 2021 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a United Nations panel formed to assess the science of climate change. This group created a climate model that would predict global average surface temperature based on inputs. They then created different simulations based on different combination of changes to the Earth's climate. These shaded areas represent the ranges of temperature based on each model. The red shaded area is a simulation that includes the effects of only human greenhouse gas emissions. The green area, it shows variation from natural causes, and the blue area, the effect of aerosols, which can actually cause cooling by increasing the reflection of solar radiation. The dark shaded area combines both human-related and natural causes of climate change. The black line is then the observed global temperature over the past 150 years. In this figure, you can see that only by including the human and natural causes of climate change does this model accurately represent our global temperature. Pretty good representation of why we think that humans are actually causing this. So how are humans causing climate change? One is by generating power. So generating electricity and heat by burning fossil fuels causes a large chunk of global emissions. Most electricity is still generated by coal, oil, gas, producing carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Globally, a bit more than a quarter of electricity comes from wind, solar, and other renewable sources, which emit little to no greenhouse gases or pollution into the air. Manufacturing and industry produce emissions, mostly from the burning of fossil fuels to produce energy, to make goods and transport goods. The manufacturing industry is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Deforestation is another cause. Cutting down forests to create farms, pastures, and for other reasons causes emissions. Since trees, when they are cut, release the carbon they have been storing. Each year, approximately 12 million hectares of forest are destroyed. Since forests absorb carbon dioxide, destroying them also limits nature's ability to keep emissions out of the atmosphere. Deforestation, together with agriculture and other land use changes, is responsible for another quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is another major contributor of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide emissions. Road vehicles account for the largest part due to the combustion of gas. but emissions from ships and planes continue to grow as well. Transport accounts for nearly 1/4 of global energy-related emissions. The production of food causes emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, especially from cows, and other greenhouse gases in various ways, including through deforestation and the clearing of land for agriculture. Powering buildings is another way we cause climate change. Residential and commercial buildings consume over half of all electricity, which creates greenhouse gases through energy production. Finally, just consuming too much. Our lifestyles have profound impact on the planet. The wealthiest bear the greatest responsibility. The richest 1% of the global population combined account for more greenhouse gas emissions than the poorest 50%. Okay, so we define and understand climate change. Now we can review the effects of climate change. So climate change can lead to hotter temperatures. As greenhouse gas concentrations rise, so does the global surface temperature. Higher temperatures increase heat-related illnesses and temperatures, making outdoor work more difficult, and wildfires start more easily. Destructive storms have become more intense and more frequent in many regions. Rising atmospheric and ocean temperatures fuel stronger and more frequent storms. Climate change is changing water availability, making it scarcer in more regions. Global warming exacerbates water shortages in already water-stressed regions and is leading to an increased risk of agricultural droughts affecting crops. Ecological droughts increasing the vulnerability of ecosystems. The ocean, which soaks up most of the heat from global warming. A warming ocean is a rising ocean from both expansion of water and melting of ice sheets. The sea level rise threatens coastal communities and ecosystems, and as the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide, it also becomes more acidic, endangering marine life and ecosystems. Changes in climate and increases in extreme weather events are among the reasons behind famine and a global rise in hunger and poor nutrition. And finally, poverty and displacement. Climate change increases the factors that put and keep people in poverty. Over the past 2 decades, weather-related events have displaced an estimated 23 million people on average each year, leaving many more vulnerable to organisms. Okay. So we reviewed lots of effects of climate change. Now we can move on to talking about climate change's effect on health. So per UN reports on climate change, it's projected to be the single biggest health threat facing humanity. The impacts are already harming health through air pollution, disease, extreme weather events, forced displacement, food insecurity, and pressures on mental health. Each year, environmental factors are projected to take the lives of around 13 million people and disproportionately affects people of color and low socioeconomic status. The effects of climate change on health are through both direct and indirect ways. There are specific connections between the effects of climate change and our specific patient populations too. Some epidemiologic models have suggested that climate change could have an effect on fertility through changing economic and social demands. The most direct health threat from climate change in reproductive populations is through the increase in both temperature and air pollution. Here's an infographic released by the Health Environmental Alliance, FIGO, and UCSF to spread information on the connection between climate change and pregnancy. This poster specifically touches on climate change impacts on maternal health, including preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and effects on brain development. I really like their quote up here. The health impacts of our global climate crisis on maternal and child health can no longer be ignored. It's a call to action to our profession. Looking deeper at the data, multiple studies demonstrate the effects of climate change on maternal health. Next, we'll review some of them. So one study out of Southern California looked at retrospective data over 10 years, consisting of over 81,000 births. They looked at exposure to 2 major air pollutants known to affect health and that are commonly created by our heavy driving culture: nitrous oxide and small particulate matter. They used geographic data to map out magnitude of exposure split into quartiles and ran a regression model to calculate an odds ratio of developing preeclampsia, defined as with and without severe features, or preterm delivery based on exposure level. In this graph, you can see they normalize the results based on the first quartile, seen on the bottom, of air pollution exposure. They then showed the odds ratio of developing preeclampsia for each quartile exposure for both nitrous oxide on the left and small particulate matter on the right. You can see that with each increase in quartile, there were subsequent increases in odds of developing preeclampsia. They found that even when adjusting for other variables, including maternal age, race, parity, poverty level, and medical comorbidities, pregnant people were 11% more likely to develop preeclampsia for every quartile and increased air pollution exposure to nitrous oxide. This data shows the risks our patients take on when they're exposed to common air pollutants. Looking at the same data for preterm delivery, which they defined as less than 37 weeks, moderate preterm delivery, which was defined as less than 35 weeks, and very preterm delivery defined as less than 30 weeks, the trends were the same. Again, nitrous oxide is on the left and small particulate matter is on the right. In this graph, they show the odds ratio of developing preterm delivery for each quartile of each level of preterm delivery. With increases in quartile of exposure, there were increases in risks of preterm delivery, especially delivery less than 30 weeks with the highest quartile exposure to nitrous oxide. Again, this connection between environmental air pollution exposure and preterm delivery helps put in perspective the risk to our patients. Another study, a retrospective cohort study, looked at the impact of ambient temperature on stillbirth rates. They looked at over 223,000 births, 900 of which were stillbirths from all over the country. You can see these are all their study locations. They looked at local temperatures during each trimester and across the whole pregnancy, and then compared rates of stillbirth of pregnant people who were exposed to the top 10 percentile of temperatures, normalized to each location. They then compared these to pregnant people who were exposed to the middle 80th percent of local temperatures. Simply, they compared stillbirth rates for people exposed to the hottest temperatures in each locality to people exposed to average temperature. They found a positive association between stillbirth and whole pregnancy exposure to the highest level of heat. They found that people in this top 10% were almost 4 times more likely to undergo stillbirth. They found that approximately 17% of stillbirths were potentially attributed to chronic heat exposure. When mapped onto US totals, this amounts to approximately 1,000 annual stillbirths possibly attributed to chronic heat exposure. Next, I want to look at another study, a prospective cohort study of data. It looked at the association between heat exposure and adverse pregnancy outcomes. They looked at 2 cohorts of around 400 pregnant people, each one with heat exposures above a threshold limit and the other below a limit. They compared the amount of adverse birth outcomes as a composite score made up of miscarriage, low birth weight, preterm birth, stillbirth, and growth restriction. You can see in this bottom row highlighted, they found a 2-fold increase in composite adverse pregnancy outcomes in a group exposed to excess heat, an increase from 9% of people to 17%. There have been many more studies looking at the effects of environmental exposure, such as heat and air pollution, on maternal and fetal outcomes. One systemic review looked at dozens of studies and pulled their most interesting findings. Of a total of 57 studies, 48 on air pollution and 9 on heat, most showed a significant association of air pollution and heat exposure with birth outcomes across all US geographic regions. Looking at the combined studies, they were able to estimate the increased risk of premature birth, low birth rate, and stillbirth with exposure to pollution and excess heat. Notable findings from across the systematic review include that preterm birth rate increased 52% for asthmatic mothers exposed to air pollution, and increased 11% for every 5.6 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. There was a geographic proximity-dependent relationship between low birth weight and proximity to solid waste plants. And another study found an association between birth rate and temperature increase, and were able to demonstrate a 16-gram decrease in fetal weight for every quartile increase in ambient temperature. The subpopulations at highest risk were people with asthma and minority groups, especially Black mothers. This data continually finds associations between the effects of climate change and negative birth outcomes. So the effects of climate change will also affect our patients through disruptions in care. This is especially evident where care requires complex and integrated infrastructure. These systems can be disrupted by climate change, such as extreme weather events, flooding, and sea level rise. For example, last year, after Hurricane Helene, we were in severe IV bag shortage. As our climate changes and our weather systems become more volatile, our medical system will continue to be increasingly susceptible to disruptions. After Hurricane Irma and Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, patients who were being treated for GYN cancers had significant disruptions in their care. One study looked to qualify the effects and found that damage to infrastructure and loss of basic services caused many delays in oncologic care for women for up to 9 months after the hurricanes. Specifically, there was a breakdown in ability to communicate with patients and provide clinic and pharmacy services. Those receiving active therapy, including surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy, saw the most considerable changes to their care. In this study, patients were interviewed to get their perspective on what they experienced. One discussed the breakdown in communication. He said, "I did not receive any information on how I was going to continue my treatment or a contingency plan from my doctor's office." Others discussed lack of service availability due to the hurricanes. This patient said that she heard on the radio the clinic was open and she went there. The clinic didn't have electricity yet, but the doctor was seeing patients. However, the pathologist had yet arrived to work, so she had to wait again. These delays in patient experiences show our healthcare system is complex. And where it is at its most complex, patients will continue to be at the highest risk of disruption in care due to downstream effects of climate change. Okay, so far we've established that climate change is real and caused by humans, and it's having real effects globally on not just the general health, but also the health of our specific patient population. So now we can move on to reviewing the health sector's role in driving climate change. So this figure shows the growth in US healthcare associated greenhouse gas emissions, with an increase of more than 30% over the preceding decade to a total of 655 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in 2013, or almost 10% of the national total. If the US healthcare sector were itself a country, it would rank 13th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions, just ahead of the entire UK. Healthcare's contributions to greenhouse gases is complicated. Almost everything we do requires energy to keep things running, to make our equipment, and to dispose of our waste. All along the way, greenhouse gases are made and emitted. According to a report created by the NGO, Healthcare Without Harm, the majority of emissions, around 70%, are primarily derived from the healthcare supply chain through the production, transport, and disposal of goods and services. You can see in this graph the complicated and multifaceted nature of our greenhouse gas emissions produced from our healthcare society. Because this is where our largest share of our greenhouse gases come from, it makes the most sense to think critically about our supply chain when trying to reduce our emissions. So next, we can move on and we can talk about mitigation strategies specifically out of the OR. So we use a large amount of energy to control temperature, humidity, airflow, lighting, and surgical equipment. For example, in a hysterectomy, the largest generator of CO2 emissions was found to be disposable supplies, anesthetic gases, and energy use. An example of the waste we create in the OR is seen in this graphic, which illustrates the difference in disposable waste from a single hysterectomy. It shows both where the majority of the weight of our waste from our most common surgery comes from, and helps compare the amounts of waste between different routes of surgery. You can see the most weight by volume actually comes from this purple bar, the plastics, and comparing surgical route, robotic surgery creates the most weight by volume, while vaginal surgery creates the least. You can see that a minimal amount of plastics in this study were recycled. An example of one way to start reducing OR waste comes from the Carolinas Medical Center, where they formed a green operating committee with buy-in and input from the surgical department, anesthesia, nursing, and environmental services. They grouped their initiatives into solid waste reduction, OR recyclables and reuse, energy and water reduction, and charitable donations. They started and tracked initiatives with the goal of both beneficial environmental impact and cost savings. I want to focus on just 3 of their initiatives and how much energy and cost savings were associated with them. They started recycling single-use surgical devices. This initiative was driven by staffing education and by reducing barriers to recycling. They ended up diverting 12,000 pounds of solid waste per year. Another initiative was to reduce red biohazard bag waste. This initiative also started with education on only placing heavily soiled materials in the red bins. It costs 10 times as much and releases more environmental toxins than incinerate and process red bag waste compared to normal waste. With their initiative, they were able to decrease red bag waste by 75%, at a cost savings of almost $60,000 per year. Another initiative replaced disposable OR foam padding with reusable gel OR padding, which came with a savings of $50,000 a year and a complete reduction of foam waste. All simple changes that led to significant environmental and cost savings. Many of these efforts are actually replicated at our hospital over at Meriter, just across the street, where we have a green team consisting of people from environmental services, facilities management, construction, engineering, and OR and nursing leadership who work on education and facilitation of many of these initiatives. The main focus of the team at Meriter is recycling partnerships for sustainability and even programming for Earth Week. You can see some of their educational materials in this poster that they have around the OR. With this image on the right is one that they have just with some helpful recycling rules of thumb to help people in the middle of their OR day. The green team was also helpful for providing a lot of the information used in this presentation. Looking at the data from a report from 2023, we can see that approximately 25% of the solid waste we recycle, solid waste is actually recycled from Meriter Hospital's ORs. And last year we were able to recycle 264 tons of solid waste over at Meriter. Another Meriter success story comes from our hospital is the recycling of blue wrap. Blue wrap is the wrapping that comes on OR trays and equipment that maintains sterility. The wrapping is plastic and can be recycled. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that it accounts for 19% of all operating room waste. And the NGO Practice Green Health estimates that about 225 million pounds of blue wrap are disposed of each year. Despite being one of the most common plastics, less than 1% is recycled globally. When sent to landfills, this type of plastic takes hundreds of years to break down and may never fully decompose. The green team at Meriter worked to change this and reached out to the waste management vendors to expand accepted recycled blue wrap to include materials with medical tape, which the majority of the blue wrap from Meriter has on it. The vendor agreed and the amount of blue wrap that was recycled in 2024 greatly increased. This small change allowed the monthly amount of recycled material to increase from 70 pounds to 700 pounds, a great success that was able to work with just a small change in waste management. So we also work with an organization called Practice Green Health, which helps offer practical and cost-effective programs to reduce our environmental footprint. The green team at Meriter compiles annual data and is applying for an environmental excellence award this year. So part of decreasing our RO waste is to understand where this waste comes from and to target how low-hanging fruit, such as unused materials that get thrown away. One study that replicated this was in the ORs of an ENT department in Belgium, where they looked at quantifying the weight, greenhouse gas emissions, and cost of unused materials from their OR. They collected all disposable materials that were discarded without being used in a 2-month period and found that this was about 116 kilograms of material, almost $3,000 in cost, and over 600 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions, including both the manufacturing and waste management, just for unused material. They were then able to estimate how much emissions per case were made from unused materials, which was around 2 kilograms of greenhouse gases per case. If these numbers were mapped onto the gynecology cases done at Meriter, it would equal to almost 7,000 kilograms of greenhouse gases per year. They concluded that improvement in allocation of disposable OR equipment would lead to a reduction in waste and greenhouse gas emissions without compromising patient care. So how do we do that? One way to decrease this waste is through preference card optimization. When thinking about preference cards, we want to have everything we need without delaying the care we do, but also not opening things that will be unused and thrown away. This is important for climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as limiting our waste also limits our greenhouse emissions and our costs. One research group in California attempted to utilize machine learning in order to optimize surgeon preference cards. They programmed an algorithm that looked at errors and inefficiencies in supply lists over time and made prompts to change these. These changes were then okayed by staff. The study looked at cost savings and found an 8% decrease in cost for ORs that utilize the algorithm. This type of change would lead not just to a cost reduction, but also a decrease in the carbon footprint in the OR, something that we could implement in our hospitals for both financial savings and to decrease our emissions. Another way to limit our OR waste is to think about reuse. Stryker, one of our surgical material providers, is working on recycling operative equipment. Devices are returned, cleaned, tested, and re-sterilized. In 5 years, Stryker has partnered with customers to divert 26 million pounds of waste from landfills. Life cycle assessments have found that reprocessed devices reduce greenhouse gas emissions by on average 41% to the creation of new devices. This can be a great resource for gynecologists as we are high utilizers of the equipment, both contributing to waste and being capable of using reprocessed equipment and working toward a solution. This doesn't just decrease waste of the equipment itself, but also reduces the amount of packaging that comes from medical devices. Compared to new products, the reprocessed hysteroscope uses 34% less packaging, and the reprocessed ligature uses 41% less packaging. Looking into the reprocessing process, there are multiple steps. For the hysteroscopes, the cutting component is either replaced or sharpened, and part of the scope is replaced for sterilization purposes. For the ligature, they're broken down, cleaned, and parts are replaced as needed for reuse. This process has also been optimized and efforts have been made to reduce water demands and to sustainably source raw materials that need to be replaced. Both devices are then sterilized using an ethylene oxide sterilization technique, which allows sterilization at a low temperature without exposure to moisture or radiation and is used and approved for all medical devices. This chart represents the actual data from Meriter Hospital in 2024. Last year, we collected and sent hundreds of ligatures and myosures to be reprocessed for use in the gynecology OR. In total, over 14 tons of material were kept out of the trash and sent for reprocessing. You can see in the left column our number of surgical instruments that are recycled, and in the middle column is the quantity repurchased. We're doing a good job of collecting our materials at Meriter to be repurposed, but we're not yet purchasing and using reprocessed myosures or ligatures. This is an area where we can improve. You can also see that trocars are being reprocessed from Meriter, and this is where we're purchasing at a cost savings of over $20,000 a year. Another way to reduce our emissions from the OR is by focusing on our anesthetic gas choice. Because nitrous oxide has relatively low potency, higher concentrations and therefore more quantities are required to achieve clinical effect compared with volatile anesthetics. In clinically equivalent doses, ranked climate impacts go desflurane, nitrous oxide, isoflurane, and sevoflurane. Life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from inhaled anesthetics are several orders of magnitude greater than for propofol, making this the more environmentally friendly OR anesthetic. This graphic is interesting. It represents the equivalent amount of CO2 for 1 hour of MAC anesthesia with common anesthetic gases. You can see that starting at Meriter Hospital, up in the corner, if you were to use 1 hour of sevoflurane for MAC anesthesia, it would be like driving over to East Madison Hospital, only 8 miles away. If you were to use an hour of isoflurane for 1 hour of MAC, it'd be like driving to Sun Prairie in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. For 1 hour of nitrous oxide, it's the same as driving 120 miles down to Chicago. And for desflurane, it's driving 400 miles all the way down to Cincinnati from Meriter Hospital. Propofol is not on here, but it's the most environmentally friendly anesthetic in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Here at Meriter, the anesthesiology department received education and voted unanimously to remove desflurane in 2019. So we've talked enough about the OR. We can move on to talking about strategies outside the operating room. I want to talk about a study performed at the University of Pittsburgh's McGee's Women's Hospital, where they quantified the total environmental impact of both delivery methods by looking at components such as energy consumption, material production, sterilization, and material disposal. This process created a life cycle assessment of the total environmental impact. The study showed that vaginal birth generates about half of the environmental impact of cesarean sections regarding global warming, and less than half the impact in 7 of the 8 other environmental impact categories, such as acidification, smog, and respiratory effects. This study supports favoring vaginal delivery over cesarean delivery as a way of reducing environmental impact from our birthing processes. Looking at the different categories for all births, the processes contributing the most to environmental impacts were energy consumption due to HVAC, and the production and waste impacts of disposable custom instrument packs. This author suggests a great initial step to reduce our waste and environmental footprint in the delivery room is to minimize single-use towels and gowns by replacing them with reusable products. In terms of the HVAC system, which runs our heating and cooling, this was the single highest contributor to environmental impact of both delivery types, and recommended putting this in the context of larger energy reduction efforts within a hospital. Finally, we can conclude by talking about our most used instrument, the speculum. One way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is by our choice of reusable speculums as opposed to single-use throwaway ones. I'd like to review a carbon footprint analysis study looking at the carbon footprint of reusable steel versus single-use plastic speculums. In this study, they looked at the full life cycle of instruments and calculated the greenhouse production of processing raw materials, manufacturing the device, and transporting and distributing, and solid waste management. The big difference between the two comes from whether they are single-use or multiple use. In their assessment, they concluded that greenhouse gas emissions created through the sterilization process were much less than the amount produced via creation of a new speculum for both metal and plastic. In this graph, they compared the total carbon emissions from each type of speculum. The blue is plastic speculum, and the gray and orange are metal speculums. They looked at two, that's why there's two types. You can see that over time, the difference in emissions adds up to significantly less emissions when we use reusable speculums compared to disposable plastic ones, due to the release of much less emissions from the sterilization process. In this study, they found the carbon savings from using metal speculum compared to a plastic speculum over 500 uses was similar to the amount released by burning almost 38 gallons of gasoline. There are sometimes clinical benefits of plastic speculum, but keeping this in the back of our minds, we can directly reduce the emissions we create at work. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned. We've learned what climate change is and where it's coming from, what the effects of climate change are globally and within our professional sphere. And we've talked about strategies to decrease healthcare-related contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change both in and out of the OR. So like in most big world topics, it's easy to become overwhelmed when thinking about how hard it is to find a solution. So I want to end this presentation by briefly touching on the concept of wicked problems. This concept was introduced in the field of planning in 1978. Wicked problems are those that seem intractable due to high levels of uncertainty, complexity, and contention. These problems and their solutions are plagued by difficulty in definitions, differences in worldview and time frame, and interconnectedness, with every problem being a symptom of another problem and solutions creating new problems. Climate and healthcare are perfect examples of wicked problems. One strategy to begin to work to solve wicked problems is to focus on small, manageable changes. That's why I'd like to conclude this presentation with the challenge for all of us when thinking about wicked problems, to think globally but act locally. I want to thank Maya Jordan and Steph Barman, the two members of the green team who helped me with this presentation. We can take questions.
Any questions for Dr. Pickus? Go ahead.
When thinking about sustainability, I think often we think about how can we reuse products, and we also struggle with this idea of stability when we're thinking about reusable items. Do you know if there's any data about the energy it takes to sterilize or potentially reprocess products?
It depends a lot. I mean, I think you're comparing the energy to make new products with the energy to re-sterilize. And a lot of times it's less. I'm sure there are some times where it's more and it's use new products. But I think that there's also an opportunity to optimize both options depending on which one creates less greenhouse gases and is better for sustainability.
Ben, if like our sort of our call to action is one thing, what is one thing that each of us should do to sort of contribute? Like, what's one thing I should be doing in my practice to do to reduce my greenhouse emissions?
I think red bag waste is really easy. I think like they bring the red bag over at the end of a case and we throw away all this plastic that isn't even dirty. So I think if we all just think a little bit more about using clear bags instead of putting unsoiled things, it's an easy way, easy change.
Okay. Everyone, you heard it. Think about what we put in the red bag.
Including soil things.
Because
Because there is a limit, like you don't, just because there's a little bit of blood on your gown doesn't mean it has to go in the red bag.
Right.
Only if it is really soil, so.
There's a really funny article I read in making this that talks about red bag waste. It talks about throwing away diapers and tampons at home, and that people do that across the country, but we won't throw away a little bit of a soiled thing in the OR without incinerating it. It's kind of funny.
Dr. Kelly, did you have a question?
Are there physicians on the green team?
The one just left the green team, so there's an open position.
Ah!
Someone was gonna talk to Dr. Domeyer, their future boss, about getting coverage for that before they confirmed that they wanted to be on it.
Like that?
They meet Thursdays.
What's one thing you could do in a C-section to decrease
Oh,
your waste?
Not use an Alexis though.
We have time for one more question.
I just have a question about the blue wraps that you were talking about, because
Yeah.
obviously we use those like all the time in triage and on the floor. Is there like a recycling, like I always put them in the garbage, is there a recycling place for us in triage that we could redirect that to?
Not readily available, but what a great initiative. Dr. Max.
There's two things in the chat.
There's
Can you
two.
see the chat?
Where's the chat? I think Dr. Simpeni asked about reusable pads.
Oh, reusable pink pads to prevent slipping in the arm foam padding. Yeah, and that's one of the things that they did in that study out of the Carolinas. Or Dr. Simpeni said, can Meritor consider reusable pink pads to prevent slippage in the arm foam padding? That's one thing that they did at that Carolinas group that helped them reduce their foam, was just replacing them with reusable.
Thank you.
I have a
everyone.
question.
I think we need to let everyone get to their next set of meetings. So thank you, Dr. Pickus.